Good morning. I'm glad you could join us. Hey, there's a verse that's found in the second chapter of the book of Revelation. It's Jesus speaking to a church in the first century. And I wonder often what he would say to us. But wouldn't you like to hear this from Jesus? He says, I know where you live. I mean, isn't that kind of like what's behind the whole He Gets Us campaign? And if you're not familiar with it, Google it. I think they put out some good videos. Jesus gets us. He understands where we live. But this goes on to say, where Satan has his throne. Wow, didn't see that coming. But the reality is that God gets the world in which we live. He doesn't just understand it, as my older brother John used to say when he was a little boy. I don't just understand, I overstand it. I really get it. So, wow, where Satan has his throne. So, Philip Yancey quotes Alan Bloom. Alan Bloom wrote the book, The Closing of the American Mind. I've read some of it. My mom gave it to me. It just brings back good memories. He's a professor at the University of Chicago, where my mom went, not at the same time. But I remember her talking about the book. But here's what Bloom said. He said he was talking to his undergraduate class, and he asked them to identify an evil person, and not one student could do so. He went on to say, the inability to recognize and identify evil is a perilous sign in our society. At first, it kind of seems like, well, we're pretty cool. You know, it's like, hey, I'm no better than the other guy or whatever. But there are people that are really sold out to evil. So Yancey said his wife worked as a social worker in downtown Chicago, and actually, a pretty good idea. It's probably close to Cabrini Green. And she saw all kinds of stuff. There's gang activity. There was things that law enforcement did. There's all sorts of stuff. There was this janitor that had keys to everybody's apartment, and he'd just wear a mask, and he just did horrific things, and no one could positively identify him. Yet, she would not have had a problem doing that. Well, I'll tell you what, if you haven't seen the movie Sound of Freedom, I'm just going to go out there and say something. People who traffic children are evil. It's unconscionable. I've seen the movie twice now, because I saw it when Heidi was out of town, and I said I'd be certainly willing to go and see it again. And so we saw it last night. And again, I was so moved by it. But this time, I had to go and check out all the Rotten Tomatoes, the critics who didn't like it. And I can understand, I didn't like his acting, the plot, the storyline, or this or that. When they said that they took some certain liberties. It's based on a true story. I did my fact checking afterwards. There was nothing that was like, oh my goodness, that totally changes the story. No, sometimes they had to leave things out, because you do that in preaching. Yes, this happened, but I don't have time to go into all of that. Why? Because people don't want to hear me preach for 2.5 hours. Folks, how can anybody justify human trafficking? How can anybody do that? I'm just saying, I went after the two strongest critics, and I didn't find a single point that they were making that really made any difference as to what the movie was all about. Jim Caviezel, who of course played Jesus in Mel Gibson's old film, but he plays the main character in this. And you can get a lot of quotes from the main character. Sometimes he's like, yeah, I was portrayed too well, I wasn't portrayed that well. But there's a lot of people who wanted nothing to do with this movie. And here's what Caviezel said. Yes, people asked him, did you pay a price? Yeah, he said both of his agents quit. He had one that for 15 years, one for 17 years. He had an attorney who said, no, I'm not going to deal with you anymore. And here's the point he made. He said that if Schindler's List came out 50 years earlier, no one would have touched it, because the stuff was still happening. And that's the reason no one wanted to touch this movie. If that doesn't do something to you and say, that's evil. I know I try to come on and encourage and give words of hope, but we have to be willing to identify something that's wrong and do something about it. Don't just feel compassion, do something about it. And there are lots of organizations who are doing something about it. They are against human trafficking. Let's stand together in this, and let's fight evil in America and around the world. God bless you. Have a great day.